Welcome back, everyone. Just need to check. Right speaker, right speech. Right chair of the Fellowship Science Advisory Panel. We're good to go. So next up, I'm absolutely delighted to welcome Professor Anna Meredith, chair of the Fellowship Science Advisory Panel, to the stage. Alongside her role within the Fellowship, Anna is a professor of zoological and conservation medicine. She qualified as a vet from Cambridge in 1991 and joined the University of Edinburgh in 1992. In 2018, she moved to Australia as head of Melbourne Veterinary School and returned to the UK and the University of Edinburgh in August 2022. Then, in January 2024, she was appointed by Keele University as Executive Dean of the Faculty of Natural Sciences, which hosts the new Harper Keele Veterinary School. She is an RCVS and European specialist in zoological medicine and wildlife population health. Anna has held a number of internal and external national and international senior leadership and governance roles, including as chair of DEFRA's Zoos Expert Committee and the UK Government's New Animal Sentience Committee, and board member of Wildlife Health Australia and Zoos Victoria, and is a current trustee of the Royal Zoological Society of Scotland. I think I'll need to lie down after all this. In 2019, she was awarded an OBE for services to animal welfare and the veterinary profession. It therefore seems fitting that Anna introduce today's keynote speaker. So over to you, Anna.
Thank you very much, Neil. It's an absolute pleasure to be here today, and I'm delighted to be welcoming our keynote speaker, Mr. Peter Cairns, to the stage. Having dedicated my life's work to zoological and conservation medicine, mainly in Scotland, Peter's work is something that is very close to my heart, and I've had the privilege of working with him also. So it's an absolute honour to have you with us here today, Peter. Peter is the Executive Director of Scotland The Big Picture, a charity that works to make rewilding happen across Scotland in response to the growing climate and biodiversity crises. Despite its majestic vistas, Scotland is currently one of the world's most nature-depleted countries. Habitats have become degraded and fragmented, and iconic wildlife lost. With a highly modified landscape that falls way short of its ecological potential, Scotland is losing its ability to respond to climate breakdown. So against a backdrop of stunning imagery and video, Peter showcases a series of rewilding case studies from across Scotland, where nature is fighting back, breathing new life into the landscape and revitalising human communities. Peter has a passion for working in wild places and enjoys the close encounters with wild animals, but is really passionate about what photography can do by informing and inspiring people about the role of wild nature in our lives through visual storytelling. So I know we're in for a visual treat now, and welcome, Peter. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you, Anna. They were very impressive words about Anna's CV, but I can tell you that last time I met Anna, she was cutting up a very, very smelly wildcat. It was dead, to be fair, and I was photographing her cutting up said wildcat and trying not to be sick. Not because of Anna, but because of the wildcat. There is a working class edge, I think, to your performance, so to speak. Thank you very much indeed for inviting me. I did a version of this talk yesterday afternoon, actually, in a very drafty farmer's barn, projecting onto a bed sheet. So this building is an absolute treat. So, as Anna alluded to, I spent much of what is very, very loosely referred to as my career as a nature photographer, conservation photographer. I trotted around the world taking pretty pictures of pretty animals. But over the last couple of decades, I've gradually been drawn into this world of rewilding. And as both Niall and Anna said, today I'm the Executive Director of Scotland The Big Picture. We're a charity that works to drive rewilding forward, as was said, in response to the growing climate and biodiversity crisis. We do that in two ways. We drive support for rewilding through communications, through advocacy, through engagements events, a little bit like this, and we commit more land and water to rewilding through a network of land partners. So let's start at the beginning, if I had £1 for every time. What is rewilding? Well, if you ask 100 people, you will get 100 answers. Everyone has an opinion about rewilding. If you read the lurid headlines in the popular press, it's all about bringing in rampaging wolves and driving farmers off their land. That's never been true. It's not true today. It never will be true. But definitions do vary. That's true. For us, this is rewilding, an evolving process of nature recovery that leads to restored ecosystem health, function, and completeness. In essence, we want to see hundreds of thousands of Scottish acres that currently look something like this transformed into acres that look more like this. More insects, more fish, more flowers, more trees, more birds and mammals, and ultimately, more people living healthy, fulfilling lives as part of vibrant communities. Rewilding is an opportunity to return abundance and diversity of life to our degraded ecosystems. It's an opportunity to stitch back together a tapestry of life where natural processes drive vibrant ecosystems. Processes like predator-prey dynamics, like carcass scavenging, birth, death, decay, regeneration. These are the natural processes that drive every healthy living system on the planet. Rewilding is about encouraging rivers shaded by corridors of alder and willow to run as they want to, as they need to, allowing natural debris like fallen trees to accumulate in river channels, enriching the water for insects and bird life. Rewilding is about connectivity across the landscape, encouraging native woodland to expand, to regulate our climate, creating wildlife highways for animals to move more freely. And rewilding is understanding, perhaps, that a forest is much more than just a sea of trees. It's a complex community of soil microbes, lichens, mosses, tall trees, tiny trees, dead and dying trees, all coming together in a constantly evolving system. Rewilding is about re-wetting, restoring Scotland's peatlands that across huge areas have been drained and burned, giving them a chance to store carbon, purify our water, as well as provide sanctuary for some of our most spectacular wildlife. I could go on, and I often do, but at its most basic level, rewilding is really anything that counteracts more de-wilding, anything that joins up and enriches habitats rather than further fragment and degrade them, anything that leads to more nature and rather than less nature. Always does it. So why is rewilding needed? Again, it's a question that I often get asked. Why bother? What's the point? Well, if we zoom right out, it's because the world faces two existential crises, global nature loss and climate breakdown, two emergencies that are inextricably linked. We can't fix one without fixing both. We also find ourselves almost in the middle of the United Nations decade on ecosystem restoration. This is the first time there's been a global movement to restore and recover our degraded living systems, rather than trying to protect the fragments and threads of nature that we have left. And we believe that Scotland has a duty, the UK has a duty, to play its role and support that global movement, especially in light of these numbers. In 2023, the State of Nature report, or the latest version of it, was published, and it identified Scotland as one of the most nature-depleted countries in the world. 240 countries were measured for their biodiversity intactness, the completeness of their nature, if you like. And this is where Scotland ranked, 212. And for anybody from Wales, England, or Northern Ireland, don't get any ideas. You came even lower than this. So we're in a pretty bad place. We're one of the wealthiest best educated countries in the world, and yet somehow we've sunk to the bottom of a global league table. Just 3% of Scotland's native woodlands remain. These were once vast temperate rainforests, majestic pine woods. 80% of Scotland's peatlands are damaged and are currently emitting 15% of Scotland's total carbon emissions. 54% of flowering plants have declined since 1970, with a corresponding slump in pollinating insects. And of course, as habitats have deteriorated, so too has the abundance and diversity of life. We're now in a situation where 11% of Scotland's species are considered to be at risk of national extinction. For some, it's already too late. They're already lost. What is also lost is the interaction and interdependency of all species, the processes, the complex processes that enables nature to work. So one of the reasons that we need rewilding is that our ecosystems are not healthy, they're not functional, and they're not complete. Another reason, and it's a slightly uncomfortable reason in many ways, is that traditional conservation thinking has failed to arrest and reverse ecological decline. Now, I'm not suggesting for 1 minute that conservation is a bad thing, but if you think about it historically, it's been built around this idea of protecting individual species inside designated sites, nature reserves, national parks. Rewilding asks us to think beyond these tiny green boxes, these fragments and threads of nature. It asks us to set free those natural processes, to embrace change and dynamism in the landscape, to stretch our imaginations to what else might be possible, rather than just settle for what is safe and familiar. There's a renowned wildlife biologist in the States who I think sums it up well. He says, the essence of nature is wholeness, a wholeness woven from infinite complexity. Trying to save nature piece by piece doesn't make sense, even if we had all the time in the world, and of course we don't. But I think it is true to say that for the last 30, 40 years, conservationists have been trying to save nature piece by piece. Red squirrels, corncrakes, capercaillie, water voles, wildcats, brown hares, seabirds. At one time or another, we've had a go at saving them all. A rare species here, a fragment of habitat there. And there have been successes, don't get me wrong. The recovery of pine martens in the last couple of decades shows what can be achieved. And all we've really done with martens is given them a little bit more space and stop killing them. That's it, really. That's all the change that has been brought about. But despite these successes, I think we still struggle to see the big picture. We struggle to acknowledge that we're all bound up in an intricate web of life that ties us to the weather, the seas, the soil, the atmosphere, and every other living creature on the planet. There's also another big challenge at play here, and it's a condition that, to one degree or another, I think we all suffer from. It's a condition that we call ecological blindness. I don't think anyone would contest the drama of the Scottish landscape, but the truth is that many of Scotland's glens, rivers and mountains are devoid of the complex living systems that they once supported. They've endured centuries of burning, felling, draining and overgrazing. And because of ecological blindness, we're unable to see what once was. We're unable to see the woodlands, the wetlands, and the animals that we've lost. For most people, these simplified, some might say sterile landscapes are what Scotland should look like, what they feel Scotland should look like. And because we've managed our landscapes in certain ways for decades, if not centuries, we've come to accept them as normal. We've become blind to their ecological impoverishment. We're not able to imagine anything different whereby they may fulfill their proper potential. These picture postcard images, they really, really annoy me because they celebrate a tidy, orderly, human-engineered landscape that fuels ecological blindness. They reduce people's expectations of nature. It's a form of sort of persistent psychological conditioning that blocks pathways for people to imagine new possibilities. And then there's another elephant in the room here. This is a painting called American Progress by an artist called John Gast from 1872. And it shows Columbia, the female figure, flying across the American plains, leading European colonizers into the West. And on the way, they're driving out all of the wild animals, all of the indigenous people, anything that got in the way of progress. I think this painting symbolises our relationship with nature in modern history, and it's a relationship based on dominance, subjugation, and control. And this landscape in Scotland might look very different to the American prairies, but many of the same elements have shaped what it looks like today. This is a landscape that too bears the scars of dominance, subjugation, and control. And if you think about it, for centuries we've been doing exactly what those American colonizers did. We've been pitching our economic systems in direct competition with our ecological systems. Short-term financial gain is outrunning long-term planetary health. Nature is losing in a war with our insatiable appetite for economic growth. The planet is having to sustain more and more people with dwindling resources, and yet we march inexorably towards this abstract notion of some sort of economic utopia. Meanwhile, our climate is changing, and the very systems, the living systems upon which we all depend, are under threat. So actually, this is not about pine martens or pine trees or, pine hoverflies. This is about us and our survival. And if not our survival, then certainly our well-being. And well-being is important. Nature is good for us. There's now a growing body of compelling evidence that tells us that we need wild nature in our lives. So the bottom line is that we cannot carry on doing the same thing over and over and over again and expecting different results without healthy, functional, and complete ecosystems where natural processes, natural assets like geology, soil, air and water, plants and animals, these are the foundations for all life. Without those, there is no conference like this, there is no business, there is arguably no London, there is arguably no life. That's why we need rewilding. The good news is that Scotland, especially Scotland, but actually throughout the UK, now boasts some of the most inspiring and exciting rewilding or ecological restoration projects anywhere. A few years ago, I'd have really struggled to count these projects on one hand, but today they're growing in number, they're gathering momentum, and they're growing in impact. This is a project called Cairngorms Connect. This is right on my back doorstep. This is a 200-year vision to restore 600 square kilometres of forest, peatland, loch and river right at the heart of the Cairngorms National Park. After centuries of intense management, predominantly for grouse shooting, for red deer stalking, places like Glenfeshie are being allowed to breathe, to recover, to start to govern itself. Nature being allowed back on its own terms. And for the first time in decades, possibly even centuries, the old granny pines on the valley floor have got neighbours, sprightly young trees popping up next to their parents and grandparents. Hen harriers are breeding again after centuries of persecution. Golden eagles too, numbers growing across Cairngorms Connect. Highland cattle are being used to replicate the grazing patterns of lost herbivores. Plantations of Scots pine are being restructured, effectively beaten up to create complexity. Holes and hollows, nooks and crannies. Nature likes complexity, it doesn't like simplicity. The result of all of this work, more nesting sites for nuthatches, for great spotted woodpeckers or crested tits. Over the hill of the Cairngorms into the east, we've got Mar Lodge Estate, which again is giving over huge areas to nature recovery. Again, natural woodland, native woodland is regenerating, and peatland restoration is gaining huge momentum. We now know, of course, that healthy peatlands, i.e. wet peatlands, store more carbon than tropical rainforests. So if we can get these natural giant sponges working as they should, functioning effectively, they'll soak up huge amounts of carbon and store huge volumes of water. And the great thing about peatland restoration is that we know it works, and it works quickly. This is an aerial image taken at Mar Lodge Estate, 3 weeks after drains that had previously allowed the water to come off the hill were blocked and keeping water on the hill. And you can see the effect already. So this is a change in thinking. This is seeing peatlands, in this case, not as something to be exploited, but as an ally in the fight against climate breakdown. Afric Highlands is another landscape-scale rewilding initiative, linking neighbouring glens in a mosaic of ecological corridors. Some of you may have heard of Allerdale Wilderness Reserve up in Sutherland, where the owner has some radical plans, I guess you might say, to create an African-style game reserve in Scotland, complete with wolves and bears. That's what hits the headlines, the Wolfman of the Highlands, all that stuff. But what is less known about Allerdale is the amount of habitat recovery that they've been doing over the last 20 years. Almost 1 million native trees have been planted, huge areas of peatland restored, red squirrels introduced, and crucially, people are living and working on the reserve. One of the big barriers to rewilding is the fact that a lot of people think that it is anti-people, that rewilding will inevitably lead to depeopling. Again, not true. Quite the opposite. Many, many jobs are already being created at rewilding sites. Young people are being given the chance to forge a career, to forge a life in often rural communities. This is Carafran down in the borders. This is community rewilding. 20 years ago, this valley was completely bare, almost like a bowling green. But thanks to the work of local volunteers, trees are now marching up the valley sides, flowers are blooming, birdsong is returning. Loch Harbour Moor is the latest in a series of landscape-scale nature restoration initiatives. This project is convened by Scotland the Big Picture, actually. It has a vision of 50 years to create a rich mosaic of habitats, alive with nature, weaving across ownership boundaries, and crucially, in which people live and work with a sense of pride and belonging. So these are just a handful of projects that are turning the tide for nature. I just want to mention one more, if I may. 4 years ago, we were approached by this burly chap and his mate, 2 farmers who I knew previously, actually. I thought, here we go, there's going to be a hole in the chest thing, jabbing away. But actually, they had an appetite for nature recovery. They asked us, how do we go about rewilding our land? So they had the appetite, but they faced barriers. Lack of knowledge, lack of money, and arguably, in their case, just a lack of confidence to get started. So inspired by those 2 farmers, we set about building what has become the Northwoods Rewilding Network. Northwoods brings together a diverse community of people, farmers, crofters, community landholdings, small estate owners, all committed to nature recovery. The important thing about Northwoods is that it's unique in Scotland in that all of our land partners steward under 1,000 acres. Still pretty big, but not on the scale of Cairngorms Connect or Loch Harbour Moor. Now, this is a deliberate focus on small to medium-sized landholdings that haven't got the resources of these huge estates or the knowledge, but they can still make a valuable contribution to nature recovery. Since 2020, those 2 farmers have become 85 land partners, covering 25,000 acres across Scotland, a series of ecological stepping stones, if you like. Our team on the ground supports our land partners with technical support, with advice, with training, access to funding, communications resources, and critically, I think, with a sense of community, a sense of shared purpose. I think that's effectively what those 2 farmers were originally looking for. Rewilding is about restoring ecosystem health, to lock away carbon, to boost biodiversity, but it's also about building community wealth. Ecological recovery is only possible, or it's certainly easier, if it works in tandem with prosperous communities. So we work with our partners to develop a range of nature-based businesses to make rewilding an economically viable land use choice. So over the last few years, 3 years, 170,000 native trees have been planted across the network, 1,000 hectares has been put aside for natural regeneration, 234 new wetland features have been created, 90 hectares of peatland restored, 116 kilometres of new wildlife corridors have been established, and missing species returned, including what was at the time an historic release of beavers at Argety, a farm in Stirlingshire, a great example of rewilding and farming coexisting. But as I said, we also want Northwoods to work for people as well as for nature and climate. And 1 in 5 of Northwoods partners are actually community-owned land holdings. In the last 3 years, 500,000 people have visited and engaged with Northwoods sites. So I hope that Northwoods provides a glimpse of what can be achieved when a group of people, fairly disparate people to be fair, come together under a shared vision and a sense of community. Our land partners are all very different. They all operate at different scales and across different settings, but they're all committed to an ecologically restored landscape. It's said that a landscape without wildlife is just scenery, and I absolutely agree with that. In 1954, ospreys returned to breed in Scotland after being extinct for 70 years. They were persecuted to extinction. Since then, red kites and white-tailed eagles have been reintroduced and are now breeding in places where they've not been seen in generations. Badgers and otters are bouncing back, and as I said earlier, pine martens are expanding. And this brings us to a critical junction in our future relationship with nature. As rewilding starts to gain ever more momentum and as wildlife species start to bounce back, they find themselves confronted by a species that has forgotten how to live alongside wild nature. Already, I have people telling me regularly that there are now too many pine martens, too many badgers, too many otters, too many buzzards, seals, cormorants, too many inconvenient, undesirable species, too many bad animals. But what is a bad animal? And what does too many actually mean? In most cases, it means more than they used to be, more than I can remember in my lifetime, more than I'm used to, more than I'm comfortable with. It's lazy thinking. It's ecological blindness. And if, as a society, we agree that we cannot save nature piece by piece, if we agree with Doug Chadwick, that wholeness that he spoke about, we can't pick and choose the animals that we like or profit from. But we're fickle. We're a fickle species. 70 years ago, less than a human lifetime, we were killing red squirrels in their hundreds of thousands. There was a bounty payable on every tail handed in. Now today, that would be unthinkable. Everybody loves red squirrels today. But we make judgments about species and their entitlement to share our space and in what numbers. This is the latest animal that finds itself in the dock, the beaver. There's a list of 28 countries that long ago, when I say long ago, decades ago, got on with the business of returning beavers to their landscape. France now has 50,000 beavers, Germany 30,000. And of course, beavers are now back in Scotland, and in London for that matter, but it took 20 years, £2.5 million. This was the effort that had to go to returning effectively an overgrown water rat. And for some people, there are already too many beavers. And it is true, there's no doubt that beavers can change landscapes, and often quite dramatically, but they also create life.
The beaver is a keystone species. Their dam building profoundly changes the dynamics of a river and creates habitat for a profusion of life.
Beavers bring variety to river systems, variety of habitats, different types of still water, slow-flowing water, backwaters. All of these provide more places for wildlife to live.
Beavers are river engineers, and people are river engineers too. But the important thing about beavers is beavers have been engineering on this landscape for millennia, and a lot of what lives in our rivers has co-evolved with the influence of beavers. Beavers are often seen as destroying forests, but if you've ever seen a mature beaver area, and perhaps not in Scotland yet, but in Europe or in North America, they're almost instantaneously defined by the amount of woody growth around them.
Beaver can do a whole lot for salmon. When I'm talking about salmon here, I'm talking about the juvenile fish. 90% of the world's Atlantic salmon population is under 12 centimetres long, but everyone's always focused on the adults. Let's pay much more attention to that 90%. Beaver can provide food. If you put any vegetation in the river, aquatic invertebrates will colonise that pretty quickly. Cleaner water, their dams will act as water filters. The dams or the felled trees provide a shelter place for fish during high flow events. The presence of beaver raises the water table. That raising of the water table means there's more available habitat for fish. There's more fish housing, if you like. And that's especially important in the upper catchment, which is where most salmon spawn.
And with beaver pools creating a nursery habitat for young fish, breeding areas for insects, and therefore food for larger animals, beavers bring life to the river and the surrounding forest.
The UK is now one of just a handful of European countries refusing to live with lynx. It's not that we can't, there's plenty of food, there's plenty of habitat. It is that we won't. Large carnivores like lynx, like wolves, like bears are now recolonising mainland Europe. There are now wolves living in Italy, in Spain, in France, in Germany. There are now wolves living in the Netherlands, of all places. So it's not that we can't, it is that we won't. Endless research tells us that apex predators are essential to healthy ecosystems, but no more so than the tiniest of insects. It's that interaction and interdependency of all species that allows nature to work. But we believe that all species has to mean all species, not just the ones that are convenient or perceived as safe. I'd like you to imagine getting home tonight, popping on News at 10, up pops Clive Myrie, and announces to the world that India is going to kill all of its tigers, or Africa, all of its lions, or Canada, all of its polar bears. I hope, that we would all recoil in horror, and yet that's exactly what we've done with all our large carnivores. And for now, the limit of our ambition is returning wildcats to a small area in the Cairngorms National Park. Some of you might be aware of the work that the Royal Zoological Society are doing in this regard. And it's great work, it's ambitious work, but even the last-ditch attempt to save a species on the brink of extinction, on the brink of becoming yet another lost species, even this creates a fight, creates a contested space. Part of our work under committing more land and water to rewilding is exploring the potential for returning lynx to the Scottish Highlands. And as you can see from the image, we're loud and proud about it, if you like. So the question is Scotland ready for lynx?
Well, I would be conflicted, I think, because part of me, a fantastic animal, a fascinating animal, and it would be really interesting to see how they behave. But I'm a sheep farmer too, and no sheep farmer wants to have a big predator sitting eating their sheep. I mean, we struggle enough as it is to keep the lambs alive that we produce every year. As we stand just now, where sheep are often just kept in a field, there's probably a lower chance of conflict. I think the problem would be if you were putting sheep in amongst trees, which we do here. I can't see a lynx passing up a nice fat lamb, which is sitting in front of it, as opposed to eating a roe deer, which is harder to catch.
Personally, I feel extremely positive and excited about the prospect of lynx back in Scotland. They will have an influence on other predator species that are in the landscape. What they leave of their kills will be for other species, and also you've got all those nutrients going back into the soil and fueling the whole system. Trying to get all the species that we've lost back into the system here to encourage natural processes would be a huge benefit to Scottish ecosystems and biodiversity here. I think attitudes are changing in Scotland, and I do think that the issues that will come up with lynx can be overcome.
I feel that there is possibly a place for them in certain places. But actually, I'm not so sure that Cairngorm Connect is the place because of the amount of people that use it for leisure. Also because of the red listed species that we have. And I believe that we have a cat at the moment that we're trying to save, and that's where we should put our efforts. Of course, there can be a solution come to, but it would have to be in areas that were densely populated with roe deer and densely covered with trees.
At the moment, there will be areas where the lynx would definitely thrive and could survive. But if you look at the overall picture and the forest cover and the suitable habitat overall, it is quite scattered and fragmented. So I think what we have to achieve is a higher proportion of forest cover overall, like let's say bring it up from just under 20% where we are now to 30–40%. In particular, the part in Europe or in Germany where I'm from, the lynx were introduced over the last 20 to 30 years and then slowly spreading from there. And obviously, a lot of farmers, some stalkers have very similar concerns than people in Scotland have here. But I think people get used to it and accept it.
It'd be a shame if people thought that lynx were a danger to them and that put them off, because lynx are going to be as far away from you as they can get. They don't want to be near you. But knowing that there's this kind of like larger elusive creature around would give you that sense of like anticipation, and looking around would be exciting. I'm constantly getting questions from tourists about what predators we have and say, do you have this, do you have that? And I have to say no as an answer to all of them. And I always think that's a bit of a shame. People think, well, there's something missing there, you know?
The people that resulted in the lynx not being here anymore, they had reasons behind that, and they were just trying to survive and live in the best way that they could. I do think we, especially with the state that our ecosystems are in Scotland, we do have a moral obligation today to restore those ecosystems in the best way that we can, and lynx are a part of that. We need to avoid becoming polarised and continue talking to one another across different groups of people, be they sheep farmers or conservationists, everyone.
So whose voice do we listen to? Is it Andrew Barber and his very real and legitimate concerns about his business, about his way of life? Is it Schuyler and her ecological perspective, arguing that the living systems on which we all depend, Scotland's ecosystems, would function that little bit better with links? Or is it Isla, a young person who is wondering if she'll be part of yet another generation presiding over a nature-depleted landscape? Nobody is suggesting that returning links to Scotland is straightforward. But while we think about it, we should consider that right now we are choosing not to return links. We are choosing not to play our full part in arresting and reversing global ecological decline. And instead, we look to other countries to live with tigers, with lions, with polar bears, animals that are going to cause a much greater challenge than would ever be posed by lynx. People sometimes say to me, it must be great having a job working with big, sexy wildlife species. And I say, yeah, that must be great. But that's not what I do. For the most part, my job is with just one species, this one. Because this is the species that holds the key to the rewilding door. Rewilding is 20% ecology and 80% psychology. The practical idea of rewilding is a relatively simple one. Trees in the ground, beavers in the river. But the social and cultural barriers that it has to navigate are anything but simple. The battleground, if indeed there is one, is for people's hearts and minds. In Scotland, the conversation around rewilding, especially in the media, is so often reduced to just a simple debate over large carnivores or deer numbers or grouse moors. And of course, all of these ingredients play a part in the discussion. But at its heart, this is really about people and people's values and belief systems, and how those values manifest in what Scotland should look like, what they feel Scotland should look like, and who it should serve. Rewilding is so often framed as a binary choice between the needs of nature and those of people, and we've all got to get better at dispelling that notion, because pitching the needs of one against the other will serve neither. So ultimately, rewilding is not only about a physical change to our land and seas, it's about a complete reset in the way that we perceive and relate to the landscapes around us and the species that share our space. It offers us all the chance to press the reset button and to rethink our relationship with the wild world, our place within it, and crucially, our reliance on it. I'm now panicking because this has not progressed. I'll give it 3 seconds.
Welcome to the club.
Yeah, I know. I thought I got away with it. Just got away with it. So, final slide. When I was travelling down last night, I was thinking about the overlap, or the common ground, if you like, between rewilders and vets. I was doing what I always discourage others to do, actually, which is to apply lazy tribal labels to certain interest groups or sectors, because the reality is that we're all people. And in my experience, the needs of people, the wants of people are pretty much the same wherever you go. What unites us all, irrespective of what tribe that you belong to, is an absolute dependence on a livable planet. And that's the irrefutable common ground that we should all try and build on. So our job is to make rewilding happen. We'd be delighted to have you along on the journey if you're interested. You can find us here, scotlandbigpicture.com. Thank you so much indeed for listening. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Peter, for that truly inspiring and impactful and really thought-provoking talk, and for the wonderful images. Thank you. So we have plenty of time for questions before lunchtime, and we have some roving mics. So I'm sure there'll be many questions in the room for Peter. Who'd like to go first? Gosh, it's bright up here, up there.
Hi, that was a great talk. Is there anything being done about the Forestry Commission's monoculture of Sitka spruce that went up in the 70s and 80s when I was growing up in Scotland? A lot of people were given a tax benefit to plant that tree which roe deer couldn't eat and nothing could live in?
Yeah, it's an irony really, because I think you're right, those are the circumstances, those uniform monocultures of non-native species, mainly conifers, went up in the 70s, and it was financially motivated at the time. There then came a period where we perhaps realised that ecologically speaking it wasn't such a good move, and if you take places like the Flow Country up in Sutherland, they've spent literally millions pulling those very same trees out to re-wet the bog for carbon sequestration and biodiversity. So I suppose if you went back 3 years, you would say we've learnt our lesson and we're kind of righting the wrong, if you like. And then comes along the spectre of natural capital. So this is corporate organisations investing in what they perceive to be nature recovery to offset their carbon. That's a bit simplistic, but that's the basic deal. And lo and behold, the lowest hanging fruit becomes Sitka spruce. So we've kind of gone through a chapter of that being a thing to it not being a thing, and we're now back into another phase of it being a thing. And if you live anywhere near Dumfries and Galloway, you'll be acutely aware of the vast areas of hills down there that are being planted with that same species. So it would appear that from an ecological point of view, we've not learnt our lesson.
Any other questions?
If I could just, there you go, where I'm coming from first. So I'm doing a little rewilding project in Devon at the moment. I have 2 small farms. We're doing restoration agriculture, so I'm absolutely with you. The argument that we are constantly have thrust in our face in the West Country is the argument between wilding and food production. And food security. It infuriates me, actually, because food security, you know, it's not a concept that's easy to define. And what I would like to hear from you is how you rationalise those 2 aspects of your work.
Yeah, again, it's a good question and a common question. I think the starting point would be that we waste, literally throw away, nearly 30% of the food that we produce. So there's a starting point to help square that circle, if you like. The other thing is that, and I can only speak for Scotland, I don't think anybody is advocating tearing up the fertile plains of the Black Isle or Fife, where food production is quite rightly a priority. But 25% of Scotland's land area is devoted to either deer stalking forests or grass shooting moors. So these are areas of upland that are artificially propped up basically by the wealth of the owner in question. So if you're looking for low-hanging fruit for rewilding, if you like, then the marginalised uplands would be a good place to start. The third point I would make is that, and I absolutely take your point about food production and the argument of food security is an absolutely legitimate one. I would say that almost anywhere that we practice agriculture, it could be done better for nature. It could be done better without it impacting on the viability of the business. So I think there's 3 things that all provide opportunities, really. So I think we have to get away from this binary, this notion, and I see it a lot between, you know, rewilding versus people or nature versus food production. And if there's one term that does my absolute head in, it's that no farmers, no food. And I think we live in this, which is true at one level, but the reality is it's a much more nuanced and layered discussion than that. And we live in a society that is dominated by these crude binary choices that are put in front of us, and it just creates extra division, extra polarization. So, as has been alluded to a few times today, you know, the challenges we face are not green challenges, they're not wildlife challenges, they're societal challenges, existential challenges. So we do need to come together and work out how we arrive at shared solutions to some of these shared challenges.
Thank you. Question over there.
You mentioned about the blindness of many ordinary people towards rewilding and nature recovery. And I wonder how much of an issue that is in the UK, perhaps more than some other countries. So, for example, I went to Poland wildlife watching. It was absolutely incredible. But what really struck me was the attitude of ordinary people to the wildlife they are proud of it. And we saw areas where the bison came out of the forest and were eating the farmers' crops. And I was like, oh my goodness, the farmers are going to be so against this. And the guide said, why? There's plenty for everyone. And then we met a lady in a hotel in the centre of Warsaw. And I said, oh, we were hoping to see wolves when we get out into the countryside. And she was so proud. She said, my brother lives on the outskirts of Warsaw. He has wolves in his garden. Isn't that fantastic? You know, obviously they keep their distance from them, but they're not afraid. There's not this kind of fear like you mentioned about the lynx. And I just wonder what we can learn from ordinary people in Poland, for example.
Yeah, it's another really good question. I think, you know, going back to the food thing, if I just draw a quick analogy, it's not really very different to that sort of disconnection between where our food comes from. You know, I think we all recognise that. And this is the same thing. Our cultural memory doesn't allow us to envisage living alongside wild nature. We've become so used to a manicured, tidy, orderly, human-modified landscape, and we celebrate it. You know, we glamorise it, as I said in the talk. So the concept of relinquishing some control, and that's another big word in this conversation, to wild nature, be it just natural processes or predators like wolves, is really jarring. It flies in the face of the mindset that has been put in our heads for the last 2 centuries. So the fact that we've not had large predators in this country in living memory in many generations puts us at a disadvantage psychologically, if you like, in terms of our willingness to accommodate these animals. There is also another sort of little bit of a nuance factor in that most of these large predators have recolonized Europe gradually, and they've crossed borders to do so. So wolves moved into Germany about 15 years ago, obviously more recently into the Netherlands. We're an island, so we would literally have to physically pick up these animals and move them in. And then again, that's another big psychological barrier. So in answer to your question, I think, you know, the disconnection with wild nature is what creates fear, what creates apprehension, which creates this resistance to the sort of loss of control. And other countries do it so much better. You're absolutely right. We had, just very quickly, we had a group of farmers over in Switzerland just about 2 months ago. It was a study tour so that they could talk to farmers in Switzerland about their experience of living with lynx. And I wasn't there, but my colleague said to me, you know, the first question was to Farmer A, what's it like to live with lynx? And he just sort of stared and, why is that even a question? It's just, what are you asking me? They're around, I get on with my business, they get on with their business, what's the problem? So it wasn't even an issue for them, it wasn't a question, and yet it's a big question in our heads. So yeah, again, it's back to the sort of 80% psychology, most of it is in here.
Hello, hi.
In the middle there.
Just, you're in a room full of vets, what role the veterinary professions in the big picture that you're painting?
I guess you could probably answer that better than I can, but I think increasingly, again, as has been alluded to, this is about a sort of a collaboration, if you like. We were contacted recently by a couple of vets in Yorkshire who had heard about the idea of bringing in Taurus cattle. I'm not so sure if you're familiar with them. So Taurus cattle are a breed of wild cattle that are, genetically speaking, very close to aurochs. They're the ancestor of all wild cattle. They're not aurochs because they're not genetically pure, but they're as close as you can. So there's some rewilding organisations thinking about bringing these animals in. And we're immediately contacted by a couple of vets saying, what role can we play in this? How can we use our expertise to fuel this? So I think there is overlap, there is crossover. I suspect that you guys work across a wide spectrum of domestic and farm and perhaps wild animals as well. But I do sense, and I'm not in the veterinary sector so I don't know, but I do sense an appetite within this community to get involved with some of this stuff, with wild nature and our relationship with it.
At the back.
Thanks, Peter, for an excellent presentation, beautiful, holistic, and pictorial as well. Obviously, you've talked a lot about rewilding, and I think perhaps part of where we as vets can help is this whole other concept, but it's very closely related, which is regenerative agriculture. You know, NEP started as a dairy farm, it's transformed into a rewilding site, but even there, with conservation grazing, the quality of the meat that's produced, the welfare of the animals now, I know there's been missteps in those areas with Osvarda's plasm, but it's, I think this is an area that we can really work to make a difference, because rewilding is part of the answer. I think regenerative agriculture helps us to actually bring more and more places, you know, to actual farms being places of biodiversity net gain as well. And the government issues around biodiversity net gain, the fact that we're now starting to look at that in areas that development, you know, farms can definitely be a part of that. Is that something that you're hopeful for as well? Is that happening in Scotland as well as in the UK?
Absolutely, and thank you for answering the previous question much better than I did. So that is a really, really good example of how there's overlap in the sectors. And NEP is an interesting example. I mean, I personally don't care what you call it. I'm not. We use the word rewilding, but you know, within our Northwoods network, there are a lot of farmers who would probably class themselves, if they were pushed, as regenerative farms. So I'm not precious about the lines between one and the other. It's a scale of movement really from where we are now into a more nature-rich future, and that will look very different in the south of England, for example, as it does in the Highlands of Scotland. But everybody can do something. Everybody has control over a certain space, be it a physical space or a conversational space or an intellectual space or a professional space. So I think we can all exert some control over, or we can all contribute in the area of that we can control or influence. So yeah, absolutely. We don't see this binary choice between nature and food or people and nature. We've got to get better at dissolving those lines and just moving along a spectrum where we create a more nature-rich future, we create a more climate-resilient future, but we also build people into that as well, because we're all part of the natural world. So yeah, these tribal labels and these delineations between one land practice and another, we've got to start blurring those a little bit more, I think.
Okay. In the absence of apex predators, what impact do you believe deer are having? Is that something in terms of reforestation and the aims of rewilding? You know, is that any contributor to some of the challenges you have with rewilding, or can that be managed?
Yeah, so deer are a hugely significant species. Certainly in the Highlands of Scotland, you'll be familiar that historically their numbers have been artificially encouraged, shall we say, for sporting reasons, for financial reasons. It's a contested space, I have to say. And it's not contested necessarily because it's about deer and what deer eat or don't eat. It's a contested space around social and cultural values and the identity of certain rural communities. So it's very layered and it's very nuanced, as all of these things are. And again, you know, going back to these binary headlines, we have to move away from that. So deer are a physical player in this space. They eat young trees, and that is a factor when you've got a de-wooded country like Scotland. But they're also a totem in many ways, as are wolves, for some of these you know, conflicting belief systems, conflicting personal values. I have to say that with deer, it was a pretty toxic conversation up until about 3 years ago. We are now experiencing a softening of that conversation, a more progressive, respectful conversation about the role of deer, the numbers that optimise ecological recovery while still allowing communities to shoot deer. The tone of the conversation is much, much more progressive than it was even a short time ago. And I won't bore you with all the reasons why, because again, they're layered and nuanced, but I think the deer conversation in some ways points to other contested conversations, for example, like the reintroduction of large predators. So, you know, it has been characterised by low trust, by siloed thinking, by mudslinging, especially across social media. The popular media perpetuate that because they love a fight. So we've got to get better at navigating those really difficult contested areas. Deer are one, farming is another, nature versus people is another, predator reintroduction is another. And I've seen with deer the way that it can be done. It's not perfect, but there's definitely more progressive conversations taking place, and we've got to roll that out across all of these contested spaces.
Hi, thank you. And again, a question that comes from a positive perspective, which is around re-wetting in Somerset levels, where we've subjectively seen more mosquitoes. And so my question is, I suppose, around what do we know around the sort of One Health, public health, veterinary public health concerns around, say, vector-borne diseases as landscapes and environments change? And are there things we can be doing, questions we can be asking? And we know that emerging disease, infectious diseases spill over where we encroach on animal environments. So what happens when animals start to come into maybe different and closer forms of contact with humans again? Are there questions we can learn about emergence of infectious disease, changes in vector distribution and so on?
I'm going to be honest, 90% of that went straight over my head. So I don't know if there's any experts in the room that can throw any light on that. But I guess what you're referring to is the increasing contact, perhaps, that humans and wildlife are encountering, and the ramifications of that. Am I reading that right?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, again, I'm absolutely not an expert in that space. I do think we can look to other countries where you do have growing populations of wildlife. And it's not, Africa and Asia, it's Europe. How do those countries navigate that? I genuinely don't know the answer, but there must be challenges, and those challenges, I'm assuming, are being overcome. But yeah, disease is not my area at all. I don't know if there's anybody else that can offer a more constructive response.
Well, I was just going to say we'll be discussing some of these issues in the panel session this afternoon, so perhaps come to that and we could talk about that more.
Thanks, Anna. You rescued me there.
There's a little question. We've probably got time for one more question after this one.
So, there's two sort of questions, slightly unrelated. Sorry, I'm here. One was, what role do you think carbon offsetting or tree planting to sort of make yourself feel better in terms of climate change has? Is it a help or a hindrance when it comes to improving biodiversity? And secondly, when you were talking about species coming back, you mentioned trees, plants, animals, but you didn't mention fungi and their role in a diverse ecosystem. Perhaps you could answer why.
Yeah, I'm not anti-fungi at all, quite the opposite. I guess I would, so hands up, I should have mentioned fungi because absolutely they play an integral role. I mean, if you're looking at ecological bang for buck, if that's your criteria, then you'd be looking at re-establishing mycorrhizal relationships far long before you would think about links, for example. But putting that argument aside, in terms of carbon offsetting, again, it's a very, very complex and in many ways immature conversation. So this, for those of you who don't know, is the principle of businesses with a carbon budget who either from a legislative point of view or a voluntary point of view want to offset that budget, and in doing so they invest in tree planting or peatland restoration or whatever. So the principle of it, the principle of harnessing the financial resources of the private sector, putting that into ecological recovery, and ideally generating community benefit on the back of that, I don't think anybody's got a problem with that conveyor belt in principle. In reality, it's manifesting in many, many different ways. So there are big household names who are offsetting their carbon currently with the Sitka spruce plantations that I mentioned in Dumfries and Galloway. That is just greenwashing as far as I'm concerned. But at the other end of the spectrum, there's a lot of voluntary offsetting where companies just want to do some good. They just want to invest in a good news nature story that they can use in their annual review. And then in the middle, you've got everybody else. So it's a big, big spectrum of activity. There are a lot of people that find the commodification of nature abhorrent, quite frankly. They find it really jarring and inappropriate. And I get that completely at an idealistic level. But then there's the reality, and the Green Finance Institute estimates that the difference between the amount of money currently available for nature restoration in Scotland and the amount that will be needed over the next decade is £20 billion. That money is not coming from the public purse, it's not coming from philanthropists. So where else does it come from? It has to come from the private sector. So you've got the ideology of nature, not being commodified, if you like, but then you've got the practicality of where else is ecosystem recovery going to be paid for. So for us as an organisation, we are very, very careful about who we work with, but that still opens up a huge range of opportunity for private sector investment in rewilding or ecological recovery. So it's a little bit of a minefield. I think the conversation will evolve and mature in the coming years. The English government, the Westminster government effectively have come up with a bit of a standard. Scottish government have committed to a standard. So I think in another 10 years, this stuff will be fairly routine. But at the moment, I won't say it's the Wild West, but it's a little bit immature.
Thank you. Last question.
Just a couple of comments about how vets can get involved with this. The first is, let's look at the widespread use of insecticides and parasiticides, which we sell, and their shocking effect on the environment, particularly dung beetles and that type of thing. I think that's a massive area for the veterinary profession to address, and we should be addressing it. The second is hecht cattle, which are used for rewilding as a close relative of the aurochs. They're really dangerous as an animal. I think vets could certainly take a role in advising what is sensible and what isn't sensible in relation to that type of animal. So those are the two comments about what vets can do. The last comment is, can we not quantify risks? So we've had mosquitoes mentioned. Okay, what is really the risk of vector-borne diseases associated with increasing the amount of wetland in Somerset or something? What is the risk of damage to sheep farming from a predator which has a massive territory and is lives at a very, very low population density? Surely there is information on that from the continent about what really is the risk of lynx to sheep. I mean, we can imagine it, but there must be data to actually look at what is it. Because surely if we know what it is, then we can explain to sheep farmers what the risks are to them.
Yep, quite a bit to unpack. I'll do my best very quickly. So thank you for the comments about the chemicals effectively that are pretty prevalent, I guess, in this community. I think that's a really, really valuable conversation that you guys could and perhaps should have. Heck cattle are not the same as Taurus for that very reason. So there have been some pretty hairy incidents with heck. I know a couple of folk that had them and had to get rid of them for the reasons you mentioned. So again, a bit of nuance, big herbivores with horns are not all the same behaviourally. But then the final point about lynx, yes, there is really, really clear data from every country where lynx exist in terms of sheep predation and other forms of predation. And I genuinely wish that science, that evidence, that set of statistics would inform people's opinions. But generally speaking, it doesn't. We're talking about people's emotional, instinctive, intuitive values that tend to override the facts, if you like. And one of the reasons we took these farmers to Switzerland was to listen to the facts, the science, if you like, and you're absolutely right. In terms of other reasons that sheep die, in places like Switzerland, Germany, France, etc., the number of sheep killed by lynx, another thing with wolves, is minimal. But that's kind of not the point. People feel Sheep farmers I speak to, the last thing they want to be told is, don't worry, we'll pay you for anything that gets killed. That's like red rag to a bull, because this is a way of life for them. This is a embedded culture that goes back, in many cases, generations. And they perceive that the establishment, and the establishment might be the government, the nature agencies, the regulatory bodies, rewilding organisations, the liberals, the greens, the vegans, the bunny huggers, whatever. You know, these are the people doing it to us. We are being forced to accept this against our will, and it's another erosion of our cultural identity and our cultural traditions. And that's really, really, really difficult to navigate, and you absolutely cannot navigate it with data and science, because it's in here. And most of our work, in fact, for one reason or another, is not necessary. In fact, we use the term, let's not speak to the head, we need to speak to the heart, because most people's choices and decisions come from here, not from here. Everybody here accepted, because you're very clever scientists, I know, completely rational people, but the vast majority of people make decisions irrationally, generally speaking, and illogically. So, yeah.
Thank you, Peter. One last very quick question from me, if I may. Links, in your opinion, will we get them back in Scotland?
For me, it's a when, not an if. So we're putting in a licence. This is slightly confidential. I'll rephrase it. We intend to lodge a licence application soon. And then it comes down to, the Scottish Government, the regulatory body, Nature Scot. And the frightening thing is, just finally, is that ultimately it's a political decision. And ultimately it will come down to the pen in the hand of one cabinet minister. That's how fickle all of this is. So we can do all the research, everything, hundreds and thousands of people working on things like this, but ultimately it comes down to a signature on a form. So we'll wait and see, but I think it's a when, not an if.
Thank you. So before I thank Peter formally, I just want to tell you about next steps. It's now time for lunch. So after we've thanked Peter, please go and help yourself to refreshments in the Great Hall, and make sure that you're back here seated by 1:55, please, for the Fellows of the Future competition presentations. So with that said, I'd like you to all join me in thanking Peter for an incredibly inspiring talk, and thank him for also answering your questions so fully and comprehensively, and giving us all a bit of inspiration and hope at the end that we will hopefully get links back in Scotland. Thank you very much indeed.